Hey guys, Gav321 here, and I'm going to college soon and I'm looking to downsize my setup. So in today's video, we're going to be putting everything in here. So I've always liked the density and efficiency of a small form factor PC, but I love seeing all the RGB and having this big display on my desk. I'm not going to have the space in college for that, so I want to go small form factor and really reduce the footprint on my desk. But the main thing that's kept me from doing this is the cost. A lot of the components are more expensive. The cases are usually more expensive. The small form factor power supplies are super expensive, and the motherboards are also really expensive. So I wanted to find a case that was cheap, had good airflow, and was able to fit my current power supply. So when I discovered the SSUPD Meshlicious, I knew it was the one I wanted to build in. So if you haven't heard of Sunny Setup Design before, they're a little Lee & Lee offshoot company, and this case came out I think about a year ago, and it's been really popular in the small form factor community, and I just discovered it. And I was really amazed by all the stuff you can pack in here. So of course it supports full ATX power supplies. It supports up to a 280 millimeter radiator, and it has a really compact vertical layout. So cases like the NR200, well, they're really cool. I just don't see the point because it just kind of reduces your height and keeps the same kind of footprint. Now I want to actually save space on my desk, so I wanted a vertical one that I could chuck behind the monitor or in the corner somewhere. And of course, it's in the name, it's all mesh. So that gives us really good airflow and a lot of options for mounting. Now, I also have the Asus Strix B550i motherboard over here, and I really like Asus. I like their BIOS, I like the looks, so I wanted to go Asus, but it's really expensive, so I used the Amazon used program, the used like new thing, and I got a really good deal, like 40-50% off of MSRP on that one. It's kind of old at this point too, so that helps, but I realized that this is going to be out of date very soon. So I do plan on upgrading to 7000 series when that comes out, but I just want to get in this case while I can. So before we get into anything with this new case, we're going to have to take apart the old one, lay out all the parts, and get it prepped to go in. All right, so now that we got all the parts laid out here, it's time to clean them all off and go to the new build. All right, so all the parts are cleaned off here. We got the new motherboard out. I had to lose 2 sticks of RAM. I knew this is, of course, going to happen. Most ITX motherboards only have 2 DIMM slots, so I'm going to go down to 16 gigs of RAM and sell that other 16. When I upgrade, I plan to go back to 32, but for now, I'm just going to live with 16 until Ryzen 7000 comes out. So now it's time to prep the case here. So I'm going to take all the panels off and show you some upgrades we're doing that's going to make this work a lot better. All right, so first thing, just take all the panels off. All right, so I'm just going to go over the layout of the case real quick just to give you a better understanding of why that we're doing these mods. So you can see we've got the motherboard that sits on here, and then the graphics card goes through this PCI riser, and they actually have it bent so that it can turn vertical and you can keep your motherboard I/O in a normal position. Now, of course, that moves your graphics card I/O to the bottom of the case, and you can see these feet included are super small. So when you have your thing like that, the cables are going to have to bend and it's going to like prop this up. Now they give you some room to pre-bend because the graphics card doesn't actually mount to the bottom. It mounts on these silver things. But of course that's still going to be an issue, and height is not my issue. It's mostly the footprint. So they actually have some 3D printing files, and I 3D printed some feet. You probably saw them in the intro. And we can attach them on here, and that'll give us a ton more height for the cables to go out. So now you can see we got a lot more clearance down there with these little 3D printed feet. Put the rubber things back on there. It's not really meant for it, but rubber's kind of nice. So now it's much higher, and we got plenty of clearance down here to bend a cable out there. So the next 3D printed accessory is these fan grills. So I just designed these in Autodesk Inventor, and they're just something that goes over our fan here that will cover it from cables. So when you have an ATX power supply in this, it's going to stick out to probably here. We'll see when we install it, but the cooler is going to be very tight. So in order to make the cable runs, the cables are going to have to be right up against the back of the fan. So having some fan grills is really nice. So I printed a couple of these, and we can throw them on there and see how this works. And just to let you guys know, I do use an Ender 3 Pro printer. I've always had it for robotics in high school, but I printed the legs and the fan grills with it, and it was designed in Autodesk Inventor, like I said. So the next modification has to do with the graphics card and the motherboard placement. Now, you probably saw in the intro this little case of standoffs here. I'll link all this modifications I'm doing to this in the description here, but this is just a standoff kit from Amazon, and it allows us to push the motherboard and the graphics card out. So since I have NVIDIA's Founders Edition card, it has the blow-through cooler, which you can maybe see there in the camera. So one of the fans blows straight through the card, and the other one does the typical blow in and blow out the back. But when you have this flow-through design, it really needs airflow on the back in order to function properly. When you have this case in its typical orientation, the graphics card ends up right up against the motherboard tray, and so you're essentially blowing hot air into the back of the motherboard, and it's kind of squeezing it. So since the Founders Edition is only 2 slots, we can use these standoffs here to extend the PCIe slot out and mount the graphics card right up against the mesh. Since it's not tempered glass, we actually are better off closer to the mesh. So we can push the graphics card all the way over here and give that flow through plenty of room to exhaust it out. And then since I'm using an ATX power supply as well, I'm not going to have nearly as much room to cable manage because I'm using a AAO and an ATX power supply. So in order to help with that, I moved the motherboard forward. So you can see these standoffs here from that kit push the motherboard out, I think another 16 millimeters, which gives us a ton of room underneath the motherboard to route cables and go all around the case. So with all that stuff about the case out of the way, we can get to prepping the motherboard and start this build. So after about 7 hours of building today, we have successfully moved everything from here into here. So I've got the lights turned on just for a show here. It's just plugged in. I don't have my monitors down here or anything, but we'll have to go upstairs and do some thermal testing. Here in Cinebench R23, I ran a 10-minute multi-core cycle test on my 3700X, and it maxed out at around 65 degrees at 4 gigahertz. This was on auto overclock, and I didn't overclock it manually and achieved a score of 11,500. And here's an audio clip from about a foot away during the run. Next, I tested one of my favorite games, which is Forza H5, and I ran the game on max settings with ray tracing on high in 1440p with quality DLSS. I was getting around 90 FPS, and the GPU got to around 78 degrees maximum, which is perfectly within reason for the Founders Edition. And here's another audio clip. So with those benchmarks in mind, I'm super happy with the performance. So with my 2-slot Founders Edition card and the 240mm AIO, there are zero performance compromises compared to an ATX case. However, there are some other compromises. So ITX motherboards usually have less I/O than a standard ATX motherboard, and that's the case here. The main thing lacking is USB-A ports, and there are 2 Type-C ports, so you can use a dongle to add more USB-A. Like I have a lot of USB-A devices in my setup, so I'm going to be buying a couple dongles for that. ITX motherboards also limit your PCI Express lanes because you only have one for the graphics card, so you can't use any extension cards. I don't use any extension cards, so this isn't an issue for me. As I touched on earlier, there are also only 2 DIMM slots, so you'll need to change your memory out if you're coming from 4 sticks, like I did. The last main compromise is with drive storage in this case. So I basically have it maxed out with 2 2.5-inch SSDs on the bottom of the case and 1 M.2 in the motherboard. You can add 3 more SSDs with a small GPU and a horizontal orientation on the top, which is a rare occasion in the high-end PC market, but it is possible in this case if you get a mini GPU. So I will have all my parts linked in the description down there if you haven't seen my other builds. They're basically all the same parts. The only thing I've added, of course, is the motherboard and the case. Overall, the build was super fun, but there were a few hiccups, and I'm going to go over them now. So cable management was actually surprisingly easy in this case, with that motherboard standoff mod giving us plenty of room behind the tray. The drive cables really messed up that bottom area there because they're way too long, and it's really close to the drives, motherboard, and power supply. They're all within 6 inches of each other. So if you could buy some shorter SATA data and power cables, it would look a lot cleaner, and you would be able to clean up that bottom a lot better. But overall, the biggest frustration came with the IO. So I had to put the radiator in the case with no fans at first to get some easier positioning in there and allow room to angle it so I could actually get it past the frame. Tried both orientations of the tubes, and I ended up going with the top one. The bottom one, it stuck out the front panel too much with my ATX power supply. There wasn't enough space where it could go in front of the power supply. The power supply is right up against the sidewall. So if you're going to use an ATX power supply, plan on routing your tubes on top. You're definitely going to need an AIO with rotating fittings on the CPU block because you're going to have to rotate them almost entirely vertical in order to get them to bend properly. Now, the biggest issue came with the fittings on the radiator for the tubes because they're really solid and they don't flex at all, and there's a bar in the way. So I had to remove the top part of the frame and this little support bar in order to get it in there, but I didn't really film it because it was kind of a disaster. I had to go up and around and then angle it back and then basically shove it in there past the motherboard. So it is barely in there, and it's like resting up against the 24 pin, but when I mount the radiator on the very top of the case, I actually am able to clear it. And with that position, you're really stretching the distance between the pump and the rad, so the cables really, or the tubes really wanted to stick up into the air. So I cable managed them straight down. I had to really shove with a lot of force to get them to go next to each other instead of on top of each other. But I was able to do it and tie it down with zip tie, and the top panel goes on just fine now. So most of the build is super satisfying because you're fitting all this big stuff into this tiny area, and it's like perfect. I'll show a shot of the clearance here, but it barely fits in there, but it does. So that's really satisfying. But the biggest area where that's not the case is the graphics card. So they really give a big area for this. So my 3070 Founders Edition fits in there with plenty of extra space. So you could fit a Asus Strix in here, I believe, no problem. The only issue I did run into with the graphics card was when I plugged in the 12-pin adapter here for the Founders Edition, I had to bend it at a super tight angle in order to clear the radiator, and I actually broke a couple of the pins off, but luckily I had that white sleeved one from my old build. It's a little too long, so I had a lot of extra cables, but I was able to shove all those cables underneath the front radiator. One additional issue I ran into was when I booted it for the first time, it displayed a USB voltage error code, and I narrowed the problem down to the front panel USB connector. There's an arrow that you line up with the board since the port is bidirectional, but for some reason the arrow is incorrect on my Asus board, so I had to flip the connector backwards to make it work. Now, I wanted to see if I was going to be able to use my power supply sleeved extensions, but you will not be able to use extensions in this case. There's just not enough space. You could use power supply cables that plug directly into the power supply, but if they're just extensions, it's not going to work. One pleasant surprise, though, is I was able to fit my Fantex RGB strip around the edge of the GPU and radiator side, and it looks pretty cool, also with some side glow on the radiator. So that standoff mod really worked well with the motherboard and the graphics card, so I'll have those linked in the description if you want to do this with yours. I did have to use an interesting combination of standoffs with the graphics card, and I'll show a picture of this, but the issue was with the full ATX power supply, when I was sliding it in, the little standoff screw stuck through the tray too much and it was scraping it. So I had to kind of stand it off even more, and that means I had to use a weird combination in order to actually get it to line up. So when it comes to my 3D printed parts, they did work pretty well. I had to take the rubber pads off the fans in order to get the fan grills on. The screw just wouldn't thread into the radiator if I had those on, but it did work after that. And the feed extensions work great, as you can see here, and the monitor cables fit below the case just fine now, and the rubber pads fit on there too. And I got what I wanted with a whole section of my desk back to me. My previous motherboard didn't have a 3-pin argb header, so I had to use the Cooler Master Mesh controller, and that kind of sucked because then I had to use multiple softwares. This one has an argb header, so I was able to plug in everything, and Armory Crate actually works pretty well with Aura Creator in order to get the effects synced up. Overall, I would highly recommend this case. It was a little bit of a harder build. Normally, these builds should take you 3 hours. This took about 7 hours. Now I am filming it too, so that adds some time. But it took a while to just try stuff and plan things out. But if you think this kind of stuff is fun, I think it's definitely worth it. So, as you've all probably noticed, I haven't posted in a really long time, and I've just been really busy. Obviously, I'm going to college now, so I was really busy during that school year. So I didn't really film anything. I might film a couple more videos this summer, but definitely want to film any PC stuff that I do. Thank you guys so much for watching, and if you have any comments or suggestions for other videos, leave them down in the comments section, and I'll be sure to reply. And with that, I'm out.